So in this continuation video, we're going to talk a little bit about continental drift. So we earlier talked about Pangea and how all the continents were together, and continents can actually move, and really it's because you have to remember that the Earth, you have to go back to like your older elementary school days, the Earth sits on the crust, and that's the part that we're sitting on, and the crust is broken up into little pieces. And those pieces move against each other, and if they sometimes get stuck and they slide against each other, you can get an earthquake or something like that. And so if you go in your book, figure 18.2 does a really good job of showing how the continents break apart. And so really, if we just know that the continents break apart and they move, and they can shift around and things like that. And so some of the evidence, too, for the fact that Pangea used to be, and we used to have all these continents together, is that fossils from South America are very close, or closely related to fossils in Africa, because they used to be next door to each other. Okay, because they used to all be one continent. Some of the other evidence that we see for a lot of this stuff is the idea of this radioactive decay. And that's kind of what they do. They date them. And so it's a little tricky if you don't know that much about molecules, and we haven't talked about them yet, but all molecules have radioactive isotopes. So they have the same number of protons, but they might have more neutrons in their nucleus. Okay, so they have radioactive isotopes that actually decay over time. And you can measure how fast they decay. So, for example, carbon-14 that's radioactive, and it will decays into carbon-12. And so they can actually measure how much carbon-14 is currently present in an organism, and so they can actually figure out how old it is, or a fossil really is what they're going to look at. Okay, and so we can say it's used to determine how much has decayed, and how old the fossil is. Okay. They also use other molecules just besides carbon's probably the most common one, but they do use other molecules in that carbon dating process. And so you don't actually have to know exactly how it works. You just have to know that they use it. And then the last thing we're talking about is actually from 20.1. So this is the idea of the endosymbiotic theory. This picture is also in your book. But what happens is, a long time ago, the young Earth, earlier in the Earth, there was lots of different types of bacteria. So there were bigger bacteria, there were oxygen-breathing bacteria, there were photosynthetic bacteria producing oxygen. And then what happened is, after a while, is that sometimes some of that membrane of the bacteria started to pinch in, and then you started to get things like the nucleus, the ER, the Golgi, all originated from these folds in the plasma membrane. And then what happened is one bacteria, this bigger one, engulfed a smaller bacteria, and you got things like mitochondria and chloroplasts. And so they actually got engulfed, and they came to live inside these larger cells. And so now you get these big modern plant and animal cells that have all kinds of compartments and ways to do things. So they have different jobs in different rooms of the cell. You can kind of see. And some of the evidence for this idea, that's the theory of endosymbiosis. So one bacteria engulfs another bacteria. So some of the evidence for that is you have membranes on the organelles. Okay, so you have membranes on the chloroplast, and you have membranes on the mitochondria. And actually, photosynthetic bacterium have two membranes, and chloroplasts have two membranes in them. So they also, mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA and RNA. And so that's some evidence that exists. And it's not always, when you do like blast searches and comparisons of the DNA, it's actually not always related to the organism that it comes from. It's more actually related to something else sometimes. And the other thing is, that this is kind of what I was saying, is that the same structures as photosynthetic bacteria are also found in the chloroplast. And not just the double membranes, but the same proteins and things like that are found in the photosynthetic bacteria as in the chloroplast of a eukaryotic cell. So that's some of the other evidence. So lots of evidence exists for this theory to have come about. Okay, so that's kind of the end of this section of how Earth and early organisms came to be.